This is Ted Rudd from Fullscope with Valarie King-Bailey presenting how to validate in the cloud. We'll start out with Fullscope. We're a Microsoft Dynamics partner that specializes in Dynamics 365 and for the industries of life sciences. Now we'll introduce you to our presenter, Valarie King-Bailey, and I'll give you a short bio. Valarie is the CEO of OnShore Technology Group, an independent Chicago-based consultancy founded in 2004, specializing in independent validation and verification, or IV&V services and solutions. Valarie has over 30 years of progressive validation experience and has worked for leading global companies such as QMOS Limited, EMC, Documentum, Abbott Laboratories, US Steel, Southworks. At QMOS, she served as the Chief Marketing Officer, where she was responsible for all the global tactics and strategic marketing initiatives, in addition to development of their validation toolkit. She also made her impact at Abbott Laboratories in Chicago, where she serves as the Director of Document Management and Quality Systems, leading a $16 million division-wide validation initiative. Valarie received Abbott's Chairman Award, the highest honor bestowed to Abbott to its employees by the CEO and Board of Directors. In 2008, she received the Distinguished Alumni Award from UW College of Engineering in 2008. And then in 2010, she received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the University of Wisconsin College of Engineering. She is one of Wisconsin's College of Engineering's notable alumni. Valarie King-Bailey holds an MBA in Information Systems from Keller Graduate School of Management and a BS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Please welcome Valarie.
Thank you so much, Ted. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Today, we're going to talk about validating Microsoft Dynamics 365 in the cloud. And in order to prep us for understanding how to validate Microsoft Dynamics in Azure, I'm going to talk to you first about the changing state of validation. As Ted mentioned, I've been doing validation for about 30 years, and over the years, systems have changed quite a bit. So we're going to talk about the differences that cloud validation, cybersecurity, and mobility bring to the nature and the way we validate computer systems today, and particularly Dynamics 365. Then I'd like to talk to you about a couple of areas that are really important before we get to how to exactly validate 365. And particularly, I want to talk about lean validation and the principles and best practices of lean. How do we streamline validation in a complex computer environment, and then what are some of the principles and best practices you need to know for managing cloud and mobility solutions? And as we're talking about the cloud, as you know, we can't really talk about cloud validation unless we talk about cybersecurity and the challenges that cybersecurity brings. So I'm going to talk about some contemporary issues regarding cybersecurity and how cybersecurity management plays into computer systems validation today. And then I'm going to get to the tactics. How exactly do you validate Dynamics 365 in Azure? And I'm going to take you through 12 steps of validating Dynamics 365 and Azure, and then I want to talk about my 7 habits of highly effective validation projects. And I'll leave you with some key points to remember after the session. Now, because of the fact that you're an attendee in today's session, I'm going to be offering you 2 standard operating procedures that you're going to need. One is for cybersecurity in a validated systems environment, and the other one is for cloud validation. You will be receiving these shortly after the webinar today, so I want to thank everyone for attending today, and I hope you find this presentation both insightful and informative. So let's get started. Let's talk about the changing state of validation and how mobility and cloud computing really present both challenges and opportunities for validation engineers today. I've been talking a lot about mobility and cloud and its impact on validation. And you can't really talk about Dynamics 365 unless you address those two issues. So I'm going to make a provocative statement to you. Validation as we know it is dead. What do I mean by that? Ted spoke to you in my bio about the fact that I've been doing validation for about 30 years throughout my career. If you look at the things that we typically do as validation engineers, it hasn't changed very much over the last 30 some odd years. There's usually a validation planning phase, and then there's a requirements gathering phase, and then there's a validation testing phase, and there are IQ, OQ, PQ tests that are developed and executed, and then there's a validation summary phase, and we kind of follow the so-called V model, where on the right side is your planning, and on the left side is, on the left side is your planning, and on the right side is your execution. Not much has changed, but with the advent of cloud computing and Dynamics 365, I submit to you that validation as we know it is dead. But cloud, cybersecurity, and mobility are really changing things. So let's look at some of today's challenges in the 21st century environment. We have now bring your own devices. So in a lot of our enterprises, it's not just your desktop computer that has information stored on it and perhaps even linked to a validated system. You may have tablet computers or other mobile devices that are connected to your validated system. The cloud brings all kinds of new challenges because what are we doing with the cloud? We're actually outsourcing a very big part of our system implementation through the cloud. Then we have virtualization technologies. About 25 years ago, virtualization wasn't really a factor. And so when we installed validated systems, we installed them on physical iron. Today, we can install virtual servers on the same physical iron. But if you take a look at Microsoft Hyper-V or VMware, whichever virtualization technology you like, now we've added another dimension to validation because in addition to the systems that we have to validate, virtualization kind of changes the focus of validation just a bit. And then we all heard what happened a couple of weeks ago where there was a massive global cybersecurity issue, and I have more to say about cybersecurity, but this changes things. And like the number one thing that I get asked is about change control and disaster recovery. How do I maintain the validated state? And how do I conduct change control? And last year, the FDA released new guidance on data integrity and managing data. How do you manage and maintain data integrity in the cloud? So all of these are cloud challenges. Now we throw in the idea of mobility and the risk that it brings to the table. So you've got malware, advanced persistent threats, unprotected data, disruption of service, perhaps on mobile devices and that. And then, the typical things, users losing their credentials, software flaws, improper disposal of mobile devices, and think about that when you're thinking about validated systems and so forth. Now we deal with apps. So if you look at the architecture of Dynamics 365, Dynamics 365 actually allows you to download apps. So think about this from a validation perspective. Apps are developed not necessarily by Microsoft, but they may come from different authors. How do you actually manage that? Now, cyber criminals are getting into the act because there are potential malicious code that could be embedded in some apps. God forbid if there's anything in the App Store for Microsoft, but Cyber threats are real when it comes to apps. Then you have unknown software development life cycles. How do these app developers actually develop the apps themselves? And how do you manage change control after an app update? And supplier audits. So the question is, should you audit all suppliers for app vendors? These present unique challenges for validated systems. And again, you can kind of start seeing why I said validation as we know it is dead. It used to be 30 years ago when I started validating, my system was basically in a bubble, so to speak. I didn't have external apps and mobility that was a factor. I had a desktop and I had a server, and we basically managed things. So what I'm saying to you is this. It's really time to rethink validation strategies. We need to rethink our strategy on system security. So it's no longer just about role-based security, and role-based security is very important, but we now have to deal with cybersecurity. In a cloud environment, we have to understand the roles and responsibilities are changing. You are no longer necessarily solely in charge of your environment. There's a third-party player, the cloud provider, that's responsible for a part of it. How does that factor into validation? And then there are legal risk, there are regulatory risk, and then there are technical risks that you have to be concerned about. Since the records that you're managing in your Dynamics 365 environment are records that are required by existing predicate rule requirements, you have to be concerned about data integrity over time. And how do you manage the data integrity? Think about your 21 CFR Part 11 audit trail, for example. How do you maintain the audit trail over time and keep the records in accordance with current record retention policies? And then maintaining the validated state. How do you maintain the validated state and manage change control and privacy in your systems? What I submit to you today, ladies and gentlemen, is that we need to really rethink how we're looking at validated systems. It's no longer the static state environments that we're used to, but in the cloud, there are different challenges that we have to factor into our strategies when we're validating. Now let's take a look at Dynamics 365, and there's a couple of things that I want to point out when we're looking at 365 in Azure. First of all, for starters, if you look at the bottom layer of the system architecture, you have Azure on the bottom, and most of you know what Azure is. Azure is a very, very robust platform that allows you to link enterprise applications together in a seamless manner. It's kind of the glue that brings all of the things together. But then if you look at the top middle purple layer there, you have Dynamics 365, and there are a couple of additions. And then you have Office 365 linked with Azure Internet of Things. We're going to talk about the Internet of Things. So what this means is that you can have things associated with your Dynamics 365 system, and these things actually may have a bidirectional communication link between 365 and the thing, whether that thing be a scan input capture device, a barcode scanner, whatever the thing might be. It could even be a piece of equipment that is linked to Dynamics 365. And then at the top of the architecture, you have the app source. And you have mobility, where I'm able to see Dynamics 365, for example, on a mobile device. The question is, how do you validate this system? So you see what I mean? When you start looking at this now, the architecture of this is a little complex, and we have to think about how we do this. And one last thing I forgot to mention, the third-party business applications on the right that are connected to Dynamics 365 that may also talk to Dynamics 365. When you take this architecture, there are a lot of moving parts that change. There's a change control lifecycle with Office 365. There's a change control lifecycle with the third-party business apps. There's a change control lifecycle with the Internet of Things and Dynamics 365 itself. And then there's a change control with Azure and the Microsoft App Store. So when you look at the system holistically, this is what I wanted to talk to you about today. How do you validate this system, and what's the best strategy to validate this system? Before we start talking about that, let's talk about lean validation for just a second. And you've probably heard of lean manufacturing. Let's take those lean principles that are designed to eliminate waste and inefficiencies and apply them to validation. So many of you who've probably been around the manufacturing area, you've heard of lean. Lean is a technique developed by Toyota, and it's a set of tools and methodologies designed for the continuous elimination of waste across the production process. So what Toyota was trying to do is to lower production costs and increase output. And that's really the name of the game for any manufacturer. So lean was really a systematic approach for identifying and eliminating waste in what they called non-value added activity through continuous improvement to help perfect this process for the benefit of the customer. So what is lean validation? If you take the same principles of lean and apply them to validation processes, you get a set of advanced technologies designed to eliminate wasteful validation activities and automate the validation process. In the technology world, automation has been applied to many different technologies and aspects of the technology world. Validation is one of the few remaining processes that hasn't been fully automated, and therefore there are a lot of waste and inefficiencies in the validation process. Our goal at OnShore and Full Scope is to try to streamline the validation process so that we save you both time and money, and we optimize the validation process for continuous improvement by eliminating wasteful validation activities and using a risk-based approach to our validation of Dynamics 365. And this is a very important concept for you to understand, and then you'll get why we developed the strategy for Dynamics 365 as we have. So what are the two components of lean validation? It's really all about independent validation and verification process improvements and validation automation. You have to have these two factors working together for 21st century validation. This truly is rethinking the way we validate. So what lean is designed to do is to eliminate waste and inefficiencies, optimize the validation processes, and maximize value and integrate quality. That's really what lean is about. But I want to focus on this automation piece. If you think about how systems are validated today, there are silo applications out there, point solutions, if you will, that are designed to either do bits and pieces of the validation process. So, for example, there is a requirements management tool on the market, actually hundreds of them. There are validation testing tools that would allow you to actually capture and manage validation tests. Not in a holistic way, they just allow you to capture the test scripts, and they're point solutions. And then there are point solutions for incident management, point solutions for document management, and so forth. Because of the fact that the validation engineer has to take 20 tools and bring them all together, this brings in inherent inefficiencies. What we would like to do is to optimize that process and streamline it for Dynamics 365 validation. So what we did is we took the principles of lean and we really applied them to the Dynamics 365 validation. So if you take the principles of lean, and for those of you who are familiar with lean, this will be very familiar. There are 5 principles: value, value stream, flow, pull, and perfection. What we did for lean validation is we took these 5 principles and added people, processes, and technology for validation to come up with the lean validation principles. So taking the first point, The value from a validation perspective is really expressed in terms of quality and compliance of the validated system. How do we measure success in validation? If the system is established in a quality manner and suitable for production, that's validation success. We've caught as many of the errors, bugs, and inefficiencies and anomalies in the system, and we derive value from that. The value stream. If you think about agile software development, most software applications, including Dynamics, are developed and implemented using agile development processes. Remember what I was saying earlier about the V model for validation, which hasn't changed in 40 years? Well, that V model has kind of been turned on its head a little bit with agile development processes. So again, we need to rethink our validation processes and make them more agile so that we streamline those and eliminate non-value added processes. We take the next principle, flow. This is a seamless automation of the validation process to ensure consistency and compliance. So as I look at validation from a lean perspective, here is what I would like to see. I would like to see the continuous flow of validation, documentation, and processes as we move throughout each lifecycle stage of the validation, from validation planning all the way through test execution and validation summary, and the revalidation of the system. There should be a consistent flow of the documentation and information that flows from one validation lifecycle stage to the next. And then when we talk about pull, this is a risk-based approach to computer system validation where risk drives the level of validation due diligence. I get asked the question all the time, how much validation do I have to do for Dynamics 365? And the question is, or the answer is always, it's based on risk. Risk should drive the level of validation due diligence. And then perfection. We always, in quality, see continuous improvement and excellence. So this is the identification and the removal of waste over time with automation for continuous improvement. So as you could see, as we take the principles of lean and apply them to validation and add people, processes, and automated technology, we can get to a point where we optimize the process by which we validate Dynamics 365. So validation of 365 is based on 6 pillars: continuous improvement, an agile software development lifecycle process, the elimination of waste, automation of the validation process, quality assurance, and ultimately compliance, which is the holy grail of validation. This is what we're really trying to do. And if we can bring these things together, they will help us improve software quality, which is really what validation is all about. It'll also help us to eliminate waste, reduce the time that it takes for validation, and reduce validation costs. Now, what kind of waste am I talking about with respect to validation? Well, if you look at validation processes in terms of planning, testing, documentation, requirements, defects, incidents, and quality, and the revalidation process itself. So once you finish validating a system, you're really not done. That system has to be revalidated until it's decommissioned. So if we look across the life cycle of the validation process, there's all kinds of waste. So for example, in the planning phase, inadequate planning driving project inefficiencies, not understanding the technologies that are integrated, not understanding the business processes to be validated. All of these things drive project inefficiencies. In the testing area, this is one of the biggest areas where there's a lot of waste in the process. Manual testing leading to inefficiencies, capturing screenshots and cutting and pasting them into Word documents, very inefficient, non-value added processes, documentation. I was at a customer recently, and the document cycle time was 120 days because they had to print out all of the validation test scripts. And in this particular validation exercise, there were over 300 test scripts, and they had to manually capture signatures from key stakeholders across the organization. Very inefficient processes. Should be using electronic signatures to automate that process and to drive efficiencies in the process. Requirements is another area for waste. Lack of requirements leading to increased effort and so forth. And then when you look at defects, quality, you do the math. There's a lot of non-value added wasteful activities in the validation process. So when we look at 365, that's what we're trying to eliminate, and we're trying to enhance the processes to drive greater efficiency. So when you look at the implications of lean validation over traditional validation, you have in traditional validation a V-model kind of waterfall approach where one step follows the next step. In lean validation, this is a very agile, risk-based process. In the validation planning stage, you have manual supplier audits where you're actually going on site sometimes conducting a supplier audit, costing time and money, and manual planning documents. In lean validation, we're capturing the independent service organization control reports, or SOC reports, and we're automating the process of developing our planning documents. From a requirements management phase, in the old traditional validation, we're actually tracking requirements in Word and Excel documents, which are difficult to manage on a granular level. In the automated lean validation world, we're automating requirements so that we can get to the version control of an individual requirement for Dynamics 365 and automatically link those requirements to test scripts. It's a powerful addition that actually helps you to effectively manage requirements over time. From the validation testing perspective, in the old traditional approach, we did manual test script preparation and execution. The thing that accelerates lean validation the most is we have automated test script preparation and execution, which is powerful. And then regression testing, after changes occur to Dynamics 365, instead of manually rewriting test scripts and executing them, we have a reusable test script library that we create for automated continuous testing. And then validation change control, in the old days, this happened manually where we pull a change control form off the shelf, fill it out, and so forth. Automated change control processes are built in, and those change forms are automatically managed through a document control system that allows you to manage the quality processes. And then document control used to be all paper-based with manual signatures. Now it's automated with electronic signatures. The validation cycle time in the old traditional model was longer due to manual processes, and now it's shorter due to automation. So you can see how lean validation really actually accentuates the validation process. The state of technology is changing, and mobility and cloud computing and the Internet of Things is here. The validation approach that you take to validating Dynamics 365 has to keep up with the changing state of technology. In all of your organizations, there's a need for speed. There's a need for quality assurance, and there's a need always for compliance. In order to keep up with the changing pace of technology, automation is the key to our future. And when we focus on quality and compliance, if you think about regulations, they're really legal best practices, and lean validation helps you to focus on the ultimate value in validation, which is delivering a system that is suitable for a production environment. And ultimately, with the validation of Dynamics 365, we want to drive out waste and inefficiency in the process to streamline that process to save you both time and money. So now let's turn our attention to the third area, and then we're going to talk about specifics on how to validate Dynamics 365. But before we talk about a cloud-based system like Dynamics 365, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about qualification and cybersecurity in the cloud. And this is what you need to know. When you look at the changing roles in the cloud, a lot of times people ask me, what are the differences of validating a system in the cloud versus validating an on-premise system? And my answer is there's a huge difference. If you take a look at the left, under packaged software, you manage all of these elements. You're responsible for networking, storage, servers, virtualization, the operating system, the middleware, dynamics, if you will, AX, or whatever it is that you're developing in terms of the application, whether that be a bespoke application or whether it be one of Microsoft's application. When you're validating packaged software, you're in charge of the whole infrastructure. But when you're validating in the cloud, whether we're talking about infrastructure, platform, or software as a service, you're really talking about splitting the roles and responsibilities. So the blue areas are the areas that you manage, and the orange areas are the areas that are managed by the vendor. So what's the implication of this? That means that the vendor has responsibilities to you, and you have responsibilities to both the vendor and to the FDA. Keep in mind, your responsibilities for validation do not change because you are outsourcing a part of your infrastructure in the cloud. So because I'm using infrastructure, platform, or software as a service, from the FDA's perspective, it does not relieve you as the sponsor or the manufacturer of your responsibilities in the cloud. You're still ultimately responsible. So what does that mean? That means that you have to check out the vendor. Let's talk about this. In a traditional world, when you're on-premise, there are several infrastructure cloud controls that you have to worry about. So if you're validating your system, you have to do a supplier management. You have to worry about change management, security, configuration management, issue management, a disaster recovery and backup recovery strategy, performance management, and all of these things. In an on-premise environment, these are things that you have to worry about. I always tell my clients, you have to be careful of the data center that you choose. All data centers are not created equal. So you have to be careful with cloud providers. Some have FDA-centric controls in place and some don't. In the cloud infrastructure control environment, these are the cloud controls that you have to now worry about that are jointly responsible. Service level agreements, configuration management, change management, data privacy, data segregation, security management, decommissioning, incident management, help desk management. All of these things are managed partially by you, but by the cloud provider. For Dynamics 365, here's the first change in the strategy that we have. We now, instead of doing either an on-site audit or a paper audit, we obtain the independent service organization control reports from Microsoft Trust Center. These reports were developed by companies that are certified by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. So just like AICPA certifies the books for a company, they will certify a data center like Microsoft's data center that houses Azure and 365. They will certify that the controls in that cloud environment are important. I had a conversation with the FDA recently, and I asked them what did they think about the strategy of obtaining the service organization control reports from cloud vendors. They said it was a good idea, and it's something that they would be codifying in upcoming guidance, because these are independent reports and they cover all of the infrastructure controls. If you haven't been to Microsoft's Trust Center, I would strongly recommend that you visit Microsoft's Trust Center at www.microsoft.com/Trust Center. Microsoft has done an excellent job of actually providing compliance information for their clients regarding Dynamics 365 and Azure, but they also provide the reports, the Service Organization Control Reports, which are independent audits of their data center. Other companies do it too, like Amazon and so forth. But Microsoft has done a really, really good job of providing this information. So what are the regulators actually interested in when you outsource your infrastructure in the cloud? Because some people say, well, can you really validate a system in the cloud? The short answer is yes, of course. Here's what the FDA said to me when we were talking. They said, systems in the cloud are still systems. And so the same principles of validation endure. They're still looking for what systems are you outsourcing, what are the issues, what are some of the challenges that you've come up with or risks, and how do you mitigate those risks? And then what are the outsourcing terms and what are you going to be outsourcing in the future? Global regulators are not trying to say that you can't use cloud computing. As a matter of fact, they're not averse to cloud computing or mobile computing for that matter. They just want you to understand clearly the controls and the risk. From the perspective of the regulator, these are the things that they're concerned about. They're concerned about the integrity of the data in Dynamics 365. Have you clearly identified and mitigated all the risk? Have you conducted a supplier audit? Have you looked at your service level agreements? Do you have quality procedures in place? Have you addressed cybersecurity, data backup and recovery, and have you done an audit, either independent or yourself, on your cloud provider? That's what they're looking at. Now, we all know the headlines with cyber. Everybody from, the White House on down has been attacked. In recent days, we've had one of the largest global attacks in the world. So there are different kinds of companies, those that will suffer a breach, those that have suffered a breach, and those will suffer a breach again. No business, no matter how big or how small, is spared from cyber attacks. But the question is, since we know that cyber attacks are a reality, how do we deal with that? The threats are expanding. 42.8 million incidents detected in 2014. And if you look at, the preparedness of companies, many companies are not prepared for this. So when I was thinking about validation and my lean validation strategies, I also started to think about cybersecurity. Now, this is a radical change because if you think about the old traditional V model, and if you even think about GAMP5, there's nothing in GAMP5 that addresses cybersecurity. This is the most clear and present danger to validated systems out there. So when we look at the annual cost of cyber attacks and the amount that's spent on system security, there is a growing gap between detection and prevention in this community. If you really want to know the truth about cybersecurity, the truth is you probably will be hacked. And they say corporate networks are like M&Ms, hard on the outside, soft on the inside. Cybersecurity risks are not decreasing, they're increasing. And it's changing the way we validate. So I want you to think about this. As you're sitting here listening to this presentation with the threats of cybersecurity, how would that change the way you look at validation of Dynamics 365? So the National Institute of Science and Technology, NIST, has developed a framework, and this framework is used globally. So it's not just a U.S. framework. This has been adopted by companies globally. And there are 5 key areas: identification, protection, detection, responding, and recovery. Now, most of the companies have tools that allow them to identify and protect. But validation engineers have to understand and adopt this framework. They have to understand how this framework impacts them and adopt this framework over time. So when you look at the cybersecurity and the risk management of cybersecurity, it involves a risk assessment, identification and prioritization of the gaps, and updating and testing the system on a continuous basis for cybersecurity. Dynamics 365, and here again, this is off of Microsoft's Trust Center, and you'll see the URL link there. They have a guide for how to actually manage cybersecurity, and they point you to all of their service organization control reports, SOC 1, 2, and 3, and then all of the ISO documentation that surrounds Dynamics 365 and Azure, and any other European standards that they comply with. Microsoft probably complies with all of the latest standards for Dynamics 365 that give you an assurance that this is a good platform to sit on. When we talk about the Internet of Things, I want you to think about this, because remember when we looked at the architecture of 365, there's an Azure IoT component. Gartner Group says 8.4 billion things will be connected and in use in 2017. Some of those will be connected with Dynamics 365. So the question is, how do you actually manage that? And how do you deal with the whole Internet of Things? This is a big area in technology. From a validation perspective, we need to understand clearly, how do we address the Internet of Things? So instead of the only qualification scripts that we develop, you've heard of IQ, OQ, PQ, which stands for Installation, Operational, and Performance Qualification. I've added a fourth one, which is called CyQ, or Cybersecurity Qualification. This is the second big change in validation. In 21st century lean validation, you have to now conduct a cybersecurity qualification. There is, this assessment consists of two parts. There is a risk profile, and then when we get to cybersecurity testing, there's a whole testing component that gets us to cybersecurity maturity. So we're testing, and we're looking at the risk of cybersecurity and identifying and documenting the risks that are associated with cybersecurity. So IQ, OQ, PQ, and now CyQ must be conducted when we're dealing with Microsoft Dynamics 365 in the cloud or any cloud computer system. So let's, now that you understand the challenges with cybersecurity, you understand the new thinking with respect to validation, and you understand lean validation principles, let's talk about the 12 steps specifically that you need to do to validate Dynamics 365 and Azure. First of all, I talked about in my CyQ discussion a few minutes ago the notion of lean validation maturity or validation maturity when it comes to cybersecurity. If you look at the validation maturity model, companies are at one point or another on the spectrum from, initial validation maturity to an optimized level 5 validation process. All companies are seeking level 5, and at level 5 is the point at which we achieve lean validation strategies. We've automated our processes, we've optimized them, we're at maximum level of quality assurance and defect protection of our software when we get to level 5 maturity. So how do we validate Dynamics 365? Well, first, we have a solution which is really a validation accelerator for Dynamics 365 called CloudMaster 365. And it consists of 3 components. Number one, we talked about validation automation before. The first step in Cloud Master is Validation Master, which is an automated enterprise validation management and quality system. It's an enterprise system that's designed to manage the full life cycle of validation processes over time. All of your validation document deliverables, test documentation, etc. We start with an automated system that is fully integrated. Then we start with number 2, requirements. You know that requirements are the starting point for validation. So what we've done is we've taken all of the out-of-the-box Dynamics 365 requirements, and we've loaded these requirements into a fully automated requirements management system built into Validation Master. And then we've taken a set of IQ, OQ, and PQ test scripts, and we've tied them to the requirements in Validation Master so that you're ready to start executing. Validation Master includes a reporting engine that allows us to take your document templates, which are codified in your SOPs, and actually apply this documentation set to your template. So when we spit out a user requirements document, it spits out in your format. When we spit out an IQ, OQ, PQ test script, it spits out in your format. When we spit out a trace matrix, it spits out in your document format. So Cloud Master 365 really, truly, it goes beyond the toolkit to provide a fully automated way to get started very quickly and very easily with the validation of Dynamics 365. So what you see here is the requirements management. These are 365 requirements inside of Validation Master, and they're used to track and manage all of the different requirements that you have. Any custom requirements that you have can be added to the system quickly and easily. So the strategy for validating Dynamics in Azure consists of the system provisioning. So Full Scope will come in and provision the Dynamics 365 system in Azure. You'll go ahead and collect the Service Organization Control reports from Microsoft's Trust Center. You'll set up your dev, test, and production environment, and then we'll come in and do the validation planning. You can draft and review all of the planning documentation. Now, when I say we will do it, we could either do it and help you with that, or you can take the validation or Cloud Master 365 and you can do it yourself. You can draft all of the validation documents, the VMP, the risk assessments, 21 CFR Part 11 assessments. The requirements for the base Dynamics 365 are all there for you. You would just simply add any new requirements, conduct your installation qualification, then you would conduct your cybersecurity qualification, which is super important. This is confirmation and testing to determine the extent to which plausible threats can exploit your system and its vulnerabilities. And then you want to do your validation test planning and execution. This is your OQ, PQ, and UAT, your requirements traceability and post-approval, and then do your validation summary documents. There is a clear, coherent strategy for validating Dynamics 365 and Azure. So there are 12 key steps that you need to pay attention to when you're doing this. First, get a set of SOPs in place for validation. Now, today, attending this workshop, I'm going to give you a cloud and cybersecurity SOP if you don't already have one. You want to conduct a risk assessment to determine the rigor of validation and what you need to do. You also want to determine and automate requirements traceability. You want to minimize your cycle times by adopting electronic signature. If you haven't already, visit Microsoft's Trust Center. You can get the Service Organization Control reports and all of the detail you need to validate Dynamics 365 and Azure. You want to automate your requirements tracking by using the automated system in Cloud Master 365. You want to leverage these SOC reports and add your own independent audit reports. automate the test script development and execution using CloudMaster 365, and real-time project management and tracking using CloudMaster 365's dashboard, which tells you how many test scripts you have, how many passed, how many failed, how many incidents you have in your requirements coverage, and other relevant information. You want to standardize your validation document templates for consistency, develop a reusable test script library, and adopt a continuous testing strategy when you're working in the cloud, and then finally conduct your cybersecurity audits. All of your Internet of Things and apps are subject to the same controls and rigor for validation testing. So my 7 habits of highly effective validation projects are plan and document everything, understand your environment, audit your cloud providers, automate validation testing, conduct your cybersecurity qualification, develop a good set of SOPs, including cloud and cybersecurity, and make sure all of your resources are trained. So a couple of points to remember. Azure and 365 are game changers. The principles of validation endure. You have to validate Dynamics 365 and Azure in a validated systems environment, and there is a strategy to doing that. Validation, as we know it, is dead, but lean validation is the new 21st century strategy. Remember, in addition to IQ, OQ, PQ, cybersecurity qualification is the new validation qualification assessment to help you combat cyber threats. And then check out the Microsoft Trust Center. If you don't remember anything else, go to www.microsoft.com/Trust Center and remember the 7 habits of highly effective validation systems. So with that, I'd like to turn it over back to Ted to talk about the next validation workshops, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Yes, we have 3 additional workshops that are part of this series coming up, and we have links to it on at fullscope.com about events, as well as at OnShore Technologies. So we'll be focusing in on cybersecurity qualification, cloud validation strategies, and best practices, and that one, the first one on June 22nd, the second on July 26th, and then automated validation testing of Dynamics 365 in August. Also, each of these recordings will be on our websites, so if you have other people in your organization that you think this information would be relevant, please bring them to our full scope site and you can watch each one of these. Also, at this time, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat box. If we do not get to them as of today, we will respond with, we'll send out emails with responses to each and every one of them. Valarie, one of the questions that came through at this point is, when you're validating in the cloud, when is it done and maintained? And then the second part of the question is, who is ultimately responsible for the validation of the software or the manufacturer of the software?
Yes, thank you, Ted. That's a great question. The first part of the question is, when do you know validation is done? Validation typically is completed when all of the tests, scripts, and validation documents and deliverables have been completed and all of the validation tests actually pass your acceptance criteria. So at the beginning of your validation process, as you're establishing your validation master plan and the testing, you will stipulate in your test plan what is the acceptance criteria on which you will accept the system. And yes, it is possible for validation to fail. And I failed it before. You can set up any criteria that you want, and that's company specific pretty much. There is nothing codified in the regulation that says what the acceptance criteria should be. So once you accept the acceptance or develop your acceptance criteria and you test, your test scripts either meet your acceptance criteria or it fails the acceptance criteria. So let me give you an example. Sometimes your acceptance criteria may say, you know, the validation will be accepted if 3% or less of the test scripts actually fail. So that means, you know, maybe 2 or 3% of the test scripts could fail or have issues, and you could still pass the validation. Anything beyond that would fail validation. That's just an example. You know, depending on the risk of the system, the tolerance level may be much less than that. But that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question, which is a good one, is who is responsible? The sponsor is still responsible even when you outsource in the cloud, and this is a very important point. Companies do not get rid of their responsibility even when you're outsourcing a portion of your system in the cloud. So, in other words, the FDA will never audit Microsoft. They will always audit you. So it's your procedures, your standards, and your ability to be able to check out your supplier. And that's why the supplier audit takes on a whole different realm when you're in the cloud environment, because now you have to do greater due diligence on your supplier because of the fact that you're outsourcing a large portion of your infrastructure to the supplier. Here's what the FDA is looking for with supplier audits, and you probably know that from the supplier audits that you do. Number one, they want you to check out the supplier to make sure that they're following good internal processes, that they have those processes in place, and that they have adequate controls in place. Now, there are 1 or 2 ways that you can do a supplier audit. You can, A, go on site and spend a lot of time and money and audit the supplier yourself, or B, you can have an independent third party audit the supplier. Enter the service organization control reports. That's why I'm telling you, as part of the 21st century validation in the cloud, collect the supplier audit reports. Those audit reports are independent and they're endorsed by the AICPA firm, and they're stipulating that they have checked these controls. Now, is that sufficient? Should you just get the audit reports and walk away? No, because your due diligence, and this is what the FDA requires you to do, you still have to do a level of due diligence. So how do you do that? That's where your extensive testing comes in. You're going to be testing that system to make sure that it's in compliance with guidelines and that it's suitable for your environment. So the SOC reports coupled with your own validation testing is the level of due diligence you need to satisfy the agency.
Thank you. Next question is, how long does it take to validate Dynamics 365?
Good question. We have a lot of customers that use Dynamics 365 out of the box, and we've done it in as little as 4 months, and we've done it as long as about 12 months. And when I talk about 4 months or 12 months, that's incorporating the implementation timeline with the system integrator Fullscope. So let's say Fullscope has their implementation timeline, and then the validation timeline actually parallels that timeline. So Fullscope would come in, provision the system, configure it for use with the customer. If the system implementation is simple and the company is using most of the out-of-the-box functionality, it can be done very shortly, 4 months, 5 months, something like that. For more extensive implementation timelines, it could be anywhere from 6 months to a year to validate Dynamics 365. The good news is that Dynamics 365 includes a lot of very robust features, so there's really not a lot of need for customization as it was in previous versions of Dynamics. So a lot of the things that people used to customize all the time are now built into Dynamics 365, and it makes it much more of an efficient implementation and validation process.
Okay. One final question as we're coming up to the top of the hour. How do you maintain the validated state in the cloud?
That's a really, really good question, and thank you for asking that one. Maintaining the validated state in the cloud means that you, A, understand when and how the cloud is changing, and that you're conducting what we like to call continuous testing in the cloud. Now, that doesn't mean testing every day, but it means that you test the system a little bit more often than you did when you were in an on-premise environment. So in the old days, when we validated a system, and some of the validation engineers will laugh when they hear this, we used to validate a system and then don't touch it. Don't ever touch it again. Well, for a lot of reasons, you can't do that anymore. The biggest reason is cybersecurity, because patches and things like that will happen. So what Microsoft has done on their website is they've given you a list of changes, so you do have visibility to all of the changes that are happening to Azure and 365. And based on the nature of those changes and the impact to your system, you would conduct continuous testing. And that's why it's super important to have an automated system like CloudMaster 365 that allows you to have that reusable test script library that helps to facilitate continuous testing in the cloud.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your time, and for everyone joining our event here today. We look forward to having you join in the succeeding webinars that we will be doing. And if you have any questions or concerns, please just email either Valarie or Kim Stiegel at Fullscope, meeting organizer, and we will be happy to answer your questions and work with you. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Have a pleasant afternoon.